Congressman Greg Steube of Florida. Welcome to the show again. Good to have you back.
Yeah, John, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I've been watching you on the floor of the House the last few weeks. You've been pretty busy, starting with, I thought, a pretty important debate with Jerry Nadler, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, who has Bill Barr before him at this very moment. But you're taking on the claim that Antifa and its violence is a myth, because that's what Jerry Nadler said. Tell us a little bit about what you thought about that.
Well, it's just absurd to think that what we see in black and white and color on our TVs right now is not actually happening and is not being organized by Antifa when they're identifying themselves as such. So to say, especially not only as a member of Congress, but as the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, that Antifa is a myth, it blows my mind. And I intend later in the hearing today to kind of briefly talk about the fact that we have a chairman who's just completely ignoring facts and video and hundreds of videos. And Jim Jordan at the beginning of the hearing today actually showed video to make it abundantly clear. Here's actually what is happening in some of these places across our country and in some of these big cities. This is not a peaceful protest, and these protests are being organized and involved in by Antifa.
It is remarkable, and I have a funny feeling. I just came back from the Midwest where I was traveling for a couple of days, and in middle America, this violence and the ignorance of this violence, the public, particularly liberal mayors and lawmakers who are excusing it, sanctioning it, or ignoring it, it's really resonating with everyday Americans. They don't like this. They want to go home at night and know that their child's not going to be shot in bed while they're sleeping. I just was struck by how strong a reaction there was in middle America to this. Are you seeing the same thing in Florida and around the state? Is this not only a tragedy for the American public, but has this become an important election issue come November?
I think it absolutely is. And I think I don't think that the Democrats realize how they're turning off independents and moderates and those people in the middle of the road. Soccer moms, suburban moms who may not have supported the president in 2018 and, kind of pushed against him, they are not going to be cool with their sons and daughters not being able to partake in activities and be safe in their communities. I just think that the mass majority of Americans are not okay what we are watching on nightly news. And the mainstream media is sometimes not even portraying it or showing actual video. You're having to search the internet to see some of this actual video. Like recently there was at a putt-putt in Memphis, Tennessee, hundreds and hundreds of juveniles attacking and destroying this place of business. You're not going to see that in the mainstream media. So I think the majority of Americans want to feel safe when they leave their home. They want to feel safe in their neighborhoods, in their homes. And if they live in these big cities and they see what's happening around them and the attack on our law enforcement, since when is it politically correct to say that we're going to defund law enforcement, that we're going to take away half of their funding, that we're going to not allow them to get militarized equipment to protect themselves? I just don't think the majority of America is where the Democrats are these days. And most Democrats will say, oh, this is just left wing. This isn't where members of Congress are. There are members of Congress that have filed a bill to dissolve and get away with ICE, to do away with Department of Homeland Security's officers. This is happening in Congress as we speak.
It is remarkable. And you've talked about the media as sort of a funnel that doesn't allow the public to see what's really going on. There was a tremendous column over the weekend in the Hill newspaper where I used to work by Jonathan Turley, the GW Law professor, who, by the way, describes himself as a liberal who has been involved in both of the impeachment proceedings against President Clinton and for President Trump. And he said something profound, which is that right now the media is engaged in willful blindness, particularly as it comes to another one of the topics that you've been very eloquently talking about, and that's the Russia abuses. And his trigger for that article was the revelation that Lindsey Graham made public last week, these new notes that show the FBI was using a counterintelligence briefing, one in August and then another in January 2017, August 16, when he's candidate Trump getting his first counterintelligence briefing, then January 21st, 2017, when he's the first day in office as president, to spy on the president, to record what questions he was asking on. What was your reaction to that? You've been pretty vocal. I saw you on Fox News the other night, Fox Business, I think it was. You're really concerned about what these revelations are pointing towards inside the FBI, aren't you?
Well, all you had to do was to look at that now declassified memo. In the very top of it has the mission, or however they annotate it, Crossfire Hurricane, which we all know now was basically the investigation of the Trump campaign and their alleged, which we know now completely false, collusion with Russia. So the whole precipice of doing a briefing to who was the president, Flynn, and Chris Christie at the time, was not to debrief him on national security issues because he was now the nominee in the Republican Party for president. It was to actually try to get evidence for Crossfire Hurricane that there was collusion between the Russian government and the Trump campaign, which we all know now is complete fiction. But that was the purpose of the briefing, and it was labeled as such on the memorandum, which even lends itself even more to the atrocities that were going on in the FBI at the time. And I hope that Attorney General Barr today will go through some of that, and I intend on asking him a few questions as it relates to the Inspector General's report that found, 17 different discrepancies or omissions or outright misrepresentations in the FISA application for Carter Page, the process in which the Obama administration went through all of this. If it's not clear to you now, it should be abundantly clear when these indictments start coming out for individuals involved in this through the Durham probe, that this wasn't an FBI that was sought on justice. This was a politicized, weaponized FBI at the highest level that was solely trying to take down a presidential campaign and then an incumbent president once he got sworn in. And that should scare every American.
Yeah, I often joke because people say, "Well, I read a lot of your reporting and you had it right," and I said I didn't have it right at all. It was far worse than I thought it was when I started reporting on it. The level of deception and the level of dishonesty that occurred in law enforcement and intelligence is breathtaking. And now you're a lawyer, and you served in Iraq. When you look at this, do you see what sort of, you just mentioned indictments, so it sounds like you're expecting indictments. That's certainly what I'm hearing. What sort of case as a lawyer could you see? Is it a conspiracy to defraud the United States? Is it false statements? Where do you think the best legal prosecution opportunities are with the evidence we now have in the public?
Well, the first thing that comes to my mind, having been a JAG who served in a deployed environment, is treason. I mean, they swore an oath to uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, and they were creating an enemy for political purposes to try to take down an incoming presidential, not just campaign, but his administration. But the easy things are going to be, you heard Lindsey Graham talk about it a couple of days ago, the misrepresentations, which we don't know who this is yet, but apparently there was a hearing where the FBI representative on behalf of the FBI just completely lied to a congressional hearing. So lying to Congress, I think, is going to be an easy one that the DOJ will be able to show the elements of. I think on top of lying to Congress, any misrepresentations in these reports that they knew or should have known at the time that they made these representations of the FISA court should be held accountable in a criminal court. So those, I think, are the easy things that they can go after. But being a person who swore an oath to defend the country, both in my service in the military and as a member of Congress, I think the level to which this agency and these individuals were trying to thwart an incoming president, to me, is treasonous.
Wow, that's a big word, but the evidence is growing every day towards the level of this plot. It really was a plot, and it was carried out for 3 years. It's remarkable. Now, you grew up in a law enforcement family, right? Your dad was a sheriff.
Yeah, my
Manatee
dad
County?
served over 40 years and was a
Wow.
sheriff for 2 terms.
Wow. So I grew up in a whole family of cops. My dad retired as a police chief. So we have that upbringing. And when you look out now, could you have imagined growing up an FBI, because I had got FBI agents who would sleep on my dad's couch when they came to visit when he was working on big cases. Could you imagine back then what we now have seen in the FBI? How stark is it as the son of a law enforcement officer, a sheriff, to see what the FBI did in this case?
One of the one of the biggest accomplishments that my father was the most proud of, and probably still is proud of, is his nomination and completion of the FBI National Academy. They have an FBI National Academy for select individual law enforcement officers from all across the country to partake in FBI training, and it's a huge honor to be a part of that and to complete that. And he always talked about it. I can remember going to Quantico for his graduation, and he was always very proud of his ability to complete the FBI National Academy as a law enforcement officer. And there's tons of law enforcement officers out there that get selected, and it's an honor to be selected and to complete it. And now you've completely defaced and torn down the reputation of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I mean, I think every American now is like, well, if we can't trust them at the highest levels, we're not talking about individual agents operating in field offices across the country. We're talking about the leadership of the FBI operating the FBI in a way that they're deceiving the FISA court, that they're surveilling on American citizens for political purposes. And it's completely discredited an agency that was once esteemed throughout law enforcement.
Yeah, it is remarkable. And it's, as some people have said, Kevin Brock, particularly the former intelligence chief for the FBI, it's going to take years for the FBI to get over the stain of what a few leaders did. It is stunning. Staying on law enforcement, because you come from that background and you've been so vocal, what is the next step in this debate? As you know, obviously we got to get control of the riots, but is there something legislatively that you'd like to see done in Congress to address first the community trust issues that occur in some Black communities with police officers, but also how we're going to go about tackling the issues of rioters? If you take away pepper spray and you take away all the capabilities of police officers, how are we going to get control of these riots? Is there anything you or the Republicans are working on to sort of put law enforcement in a better posture in all of this tyranny and anarchy that's going on right now?
Well, the challenge is you have Democratic leaders in these cities and sometimes these states that are refusing to uphold the rule of law. They are seeing what is happening to their cities and sitting back and saying, "Oh, this is just a peaceful protest," despite the fact that people are dying, despite the fact that businesses are being torn down, despite the fact that federal government property is being attacked and statues are being attacked, and that's government property. So there's already laws on the book. I looked when all this first started going on. I wanted to see, okay, is it not a felony to destroy federal property? It's already the law. So it's just not being enforced by these Democratic mayors because they're afraid of the mob. And so the first thing that needs to happen is I hope that the people in these communities that don't want their businesses torn down and don't want people being murdered and killed will elect officials who are going to uphold the rule of law. This shouldn't be a political argument. I don't care whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. You should support the fact that people shouldn't get killed, property should not be destroyed, businesses should not be destroyed. And so that's the challenge in some of these bigger cities. I signed on to a bill, I can't remember what the number of it is, but that would enhance penalties to law enforcement officers if they're targeted. They would enhance criminal penalties if you're trying to either assault and or kill a law enforcement officer. But until these people start getting arrested and locked up, and people start to see that there's going to be accountability if you break the law, I think we're going to have challenges, especially with our young people in our country, because our young people are watching this happen and saying, well, I mean, if they can do it in Seattle and they can do it in Portland, well, why can't we do it here in Sarasota County and Sarasota County, Florida, and nobody's going to stop us from doing it. So in these communities across the country, there just needs to be an upholding of the law. And I think the mass majority of Americans support that. They don't want to see property destroyed and people getting hurt, and especially our law enforcement officers being attacked for doing their job.
Yeah, that's really clear in the polling data. We've even had Adjust the News where most people don't consider the activities of the rioters protests. They call it violence. And I think that the American people is far smarter than the spin machines in the media and liberal establishments are giving them credit for. Is there a possibility? Is there a way for Congress to use the power of the purse to force some of these mayors to take action? All these cities get significant federal funding Is there any discussion among Republicans to seek legislation that would penalize a city if it doesn't, provide law and order services the way the American public expects it? Is there anything on that front that you guys are examining?
I've looked at bills that do just that. I think there's other members that are working on legislation that does just that. The challenge that we have is we know that's not going to pass a Democratic led House. So we can file the bill and have the conversations, but the challenge is it's not going to get passed in a Democratic House. So we'll file them and then it'll sit there and never get a committee hearing. But I agree with you 100%. Start pulling some of these states, some of these big cities, their federal funding for all the different federal programs that their citizens are using because they're not following federal law, and see how quick they change their behavior.
Yeah, there's nothing like the power of the purse. I'll tell you that. That gets everybody's attention, particularly these days when a lot of these cities are spending money like water. So it's important to see. It'll be interesting to see. I've been hearing some rumblings of that, and I'd love to. If you see any development, keep us abreast on that. That's a very important development. Heading into the election now, this election started as a referendum on the Trump economy, which put the president in good shape. Then the COVID-19 came along, and then George Floyd and the rioting occurred after that. As we head into the fall, what are the fundamental issues that you think this election will turn on, both in Florida and across the country?
Well, I certainly think the president's handling of the pandemic and where we are at that point in time, I think is going to dictate a lot of where people are as it relates to voting one way or the other. We've got, what is it, 100 days, less than 100 days now to the
Yeah,
election.
97 to
So
go.
much
Yep.
changes so fast these days. I mean, I haven't even been elected. I haven't even been in Congress 2 years, and we've dealt with the government shutdown when we swore in, a year of impeachment, COVID-19, and now all these protests. And it just everything's changing so fast that the electorate is kind of responding to all of these different things and how the president responds. I'll tell you this, I don't believe any of the polling that I see. I think there's a mass majority of Americans who aren't going to answer a phone call from a pollster, is out there who may not want to, doesn't typically vote, but is absolutely going to vote this election cycle because they don't think that their police should be defunded. They don't think that all of these things they're watching on TV should be occurring in our country. And I think there's going to be a huge outpouring of support for the president just because of the opposite of this would be what we're seeing today in some of these liberally led, Democratic led cities. So I feel like the more that the Democratic majority does the type of things that they're doing, talks about defunding police, actually does it in the case of New York and some of these other cities, I think the mass majority of Americans don't support that.
Yeah, it's going to be really fascinating to watch that play out. I was just struck, Wisconsin and certainly the area I was in was pretty blue, and but there's just an anger at tearing down historical statues, watching things get burned, Molotov cocktails being tossed, and I think that you're right that this probably plays out in the psyche in a way that we're not ready and probably not capturing in the polls at all right now. Another thing that I've come across in traveling lately, and I was up in Connecticut, which was hard hit by COVID, and then Wisconsin, which has had a moderate cases, a general sense that the federal public health officials, after all the billions of dollars we've given them for research and studies and infrastructure and researchers, that they don't really seem to know much. They flip flopped a lot. We went from don't wear a mask, wear a mask, don't go on a cruise, don't go on a cruise. You can go through all the different ones that we've been through. Do you think there's a moment now for us to go back and look and just examine how we're spending our money at NIH and whether, should there be a blue ribbon commission? Should there be something that looks at these public health agencies and finds a way to make them more efficient, more consistent in their recommendations after what we've experienced the last 9 months?
I hope that there's going to be an examination of all of this. I mean, we take in 3.5 trillion a year in revenue to the Federal Reserve, and we've so far spent $7 trillion this year. And like you said, there's a lot of money going to research, yet we don't have a vaccine. There's a lot of money going to our health departments and all these, And I don't think the American people know what that's going for and how that money's being spent when we're just doling out trillions and trillions of dollars. I mean, there was an article today, and I think the Paycheck Protection Program did a lot for small businesses that were told to shut down by the government to continue to pay their employees. But now I'm reading in the Miami Herald today, there was a Miami business where he spent all the money on going and buying all this stuff and not paying his employees, and that he's been indicted on fraud charges. So I think there's going to be a huge accountability on spending when all of this we have time to look back on what the government has done. And I think it's going to be very difficult for right now for there to get another package done, because I certainly don't support paying more people on unemployment than they were making at their job. That has caused huge problems for our manufacturing sectors. My largest employer in my district makes hurricane windows and doors, and he's got 70 openings at his place of business, and he can't fill those spots. And when he talks to people, all the people say, look, I'm making more money on unemployment. I'm not going to come and work hard for 8 hours a day, sometimes 10 hours a day, to make less than I'm making on unemployment. So we can't do that because we're incentivizing people not to work, and it's hurting the economy overall.
Yeah. And there was a president 2 decades ago that made a similar argument. His name was Bill Clinton. It's sort of funny how far the Democrats have come. If you remember, Bill Clinton was in favor with Newt Gingrich of workfare and getting people back to work. And today, it seems as though the majority of Democrats want to just pay people to stay at home. It is a remarkable time. There's no doubt about it. The final question I'd like to get to, because I know you're going to get back to the hearing, and I'm so grateful you took the time in the middle of one of the busiest days in Congress to come talk to us. China, you continue to drill down on the wrongdoing and that China has, and it seems as though the administration is taking increasingly tougher steps, really screwing down the pressure on China. What do you think should play out between now and the end of the year in terms of additional sanctions, penalties, investigations of China, not only over COVID, but over the other things we're learning? Like we talked about researchers. A lot of these researchers in America had secret deals with China where they were getting money on the side. We've seen some of those prosecutions in recent weeks. What do you think is important as the next steps in our relationship with China?
Well, and it's a lot more prevalent than I think people realize. There was a cancer research hospital in Florida where the CEOs and some of the higher executives had bank accounts in China where the Chinese government was paying them to send them some of their research. And there's obviously some criminality that's involved in that, and that's going through an investigation. But this is pervasive throughout our country. And I'm glad that the president and Pompeo and the State Department is taking a much more defensive and aggressive approach on saying enough is enough. You're not going to steal our intellectual property anymore. I support their decision of shutting down that embassy in Houston that they knew was the center point for stealing all this intellectual property across the country. I think we need to take a hard stand. And I think we need to continue to do that so that China doesn't steal our property, that China doesn't get more aggressive than they're being. And obviously, we all know that they knew that COVID-19 was transmittable from human to human, yet they denied that. And the World Health Organization, who they were paying to propagate their propaganda to the world, was not telling the world how infectious this disease was. They could have kept that disease contained in Wuhan, and they didn't. They let all these Chinese people travel all throughout the world, millions of them, and infecting the entire world. I drafted a bill and dropped a bill that would hold China financially responsible for our response to the pandemic, and it gives the president the authority and latitude to negotiate how they would pay for that, whether we get paying less on our debt that China holds for us or there's direct payments, whatever the case may be. It gives the president the authority to negotiate that with the Chinese Communist Party. But they absolutely owe the world and the United States for something that they could have stopped on the shores of their country.
Yeah, it's truly remarkable, and I suspect we're going to learn more as our intelligence agencies and congressional committees dig in more. There's a lot of ugly stuff still to be found out about how much we failed and how much influence they've had over the medical research community and the WHO for so long. Congressman, I could spend all day talking to you, but I know you got to get back to work. I want to thank you so much for taking time on an incredibly busy day to give us your insights, and we hope to have you back soon.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Anytime.
All right, sir. All right.